By the time I finished checking the downstairs locks, the windows had gone black enough to stop reflecting the trees and start reflecting me. That was always the point in a house like that when the job changed a little. In daylight, caretaking is mostly systems. You check heat, water, doors, lights, anything that could get expensive if it fails while the owners are gone. After dark, it becomes presence. You're the thing standing in for the people who actually belong there. I'd done enough short-term house jobs to know the difference. Ashdown House sat above the road on its own shelf of mountain outside Black Mountain, North Carolina. All dark stone, old timber, and long panes of glass that looked out over a drop of bare trees and cold black slope. Inside, it was bigger than it first seemed because the rooms didn't open up all at once. They kept revealing themselves as you moved. The main hall rose higher than it needed to, with dark wood paneling and a staircase wide enough to make normal footsteps sound smaller than they were. The lamps along the first floor gave off a soft yellow light that should have made the place feel warmer. They didn't. The heat kicked on through the vents in long, low breaths, then shut off again, and every time it did, the silence came back too clean. There was a smell to the house that I noticed the second night air started pressing against the glass. Old linen, furniture polish, dry wood, a trace of fireplace ash that had gone cold hours ago. Not mildew, not neglect. Nothing about the place smelled forgotten. It smelled maintained, like somebody had spent a long time making sure the house never slid even an inch off its routine. That part I understood. Wealthy owners always wanted the same thing when they handed a property over for a few days. Keep it steady, keep it clean. Don't leave fingerprints on the life they'd returned to. I was good at that. I knew how to move through a house without changing its shape. I stood in the main hall with one hand still on the ring of keys Mrs. Voss had left me and looked up the staircase. The first 2 levels were lit the way the rest of the house was lit, all warm pools and polished banisters and framed paintings watching from the walls. The top floor was different, not dark in the ordinary sense, not just underlit. It looked held back, like whatever light made it that far had stopped short for a reason. I told myself that was just the angle. Old houses do that. Air moves strangely. Light collects badly, floors settle, pipes click. Wood talks when the temperature drops. I'd slept in enough cabins, lodges, and empty vacation homes to stop hearing half of it. A loose vent cover, a radiator knock, a branch scraping a window, none of that got to me anymore. If a house was old, it made itself known. That was part of the deal. Ashdown House just felt a little too aware of where I was standing. That was the only way I could put it, and even then I didn't like how it sounded in my own head. I'm not superstitious. I don't spook easy. My work had put me alone in places most people wouldn't even want to walk through in daylight. Cabins with burst pipes and raccoons in the crawl space. Vacation houses where the owners wanted the blinds adjusted to make it look occupied. Big second homes sitting empty through sleet and wind with only me, a flashlight, and a checklist between them and a frozen plumbing disaster. I'd spent nights in all of them, slept fine in most. The difference with Ashdown House hit me before anything had actually happened, which was what bothered me later. The house didn't feel abandoned. It felt paused, like it had been left running. I reminded myself it was only 5 nights. That mattered. 5 nights was nothing. I'd done longer stretches in worse weather with less money. This one just happened to pay better than any short-term caretaker job I'd taken before, better by enough that I'd stopped asking myself whether I liked the house and started asking whether I could get through it without creating problems. That was easier to answer. Of course I could. The owners were going out of the country. They needed someone on site. I needed the check. That was the shape of it. I hadn't taken the job because I liked mountain estates or old money houses or any of the polished stillness that came with places like Ashdown. I took it because the money had shown up at the right time, which in my life usually meant the wrong time had arrived first. That was how these things worked. You don't suddenly say yes to a 5-night live-in job because you're chasing adventure. You say yes because your options have narrowed enough that a strange house starts looking practical. Mrs. Voss had said very little during the handoff, but one line had stuck with me all through the last round of checking windows and exterior doors. "You'll find the house easier if you don't improvise," Mrs. Voss said. At the time, I'd taken that the same way I took most instructions from owners with expensive property and old habits. They liked routine because routine meant control, and people with houses that size paid to keep control from slipping. Nothing unusual there. Still, standing in that kitchen afterward, I noticed something that didn't fit with any of the other details she'd left me. The radio on the counter by the pantry door had already been plugged in. It wasn't tucked away in a drawer with flashlights and manuals. It was set square to the edge of the counter like it belonged there. Beside it sat a fresh pack of batteries, opened neatly with the extra pair lined up next to it. That caught my eye because in jobs like that, owners leave labeled remotes, alarm codes, contact sheets, maybe a note about the irrigation timer or the thermostat upstairs. They don't usually leave a radio waiting like part of the shift. I reached over and put my fingers on the volume knob. The plastic was cool. For a second, I thought about switching it on just to break the silence in the room, but I stopped myself. I didn't have a reason yet, and I'd learned a while ago not to make little changes too early in a house that wasn't mine. You start moving one thing because it feels harmless, then you forget where it was. Then some owner comes back and notices exactly the one detail you didn't think mattered. So I left it off. Then I carried my mug into the main hall, stood at the foot of the staircase, and listened to the place settle around me. Nothing was clearly wrong. That was the part I kept coming back to later. No voice, no door opening where it shouldn't. No footsteps from an empty floor. Just the low mechanical breath of the heat, the faint creak of old wood somewhere above me, and that sense that the house had already started a rhythm before I arrived and had no intention of changing it for me. I was used to houses making noise when the temperature dropped. I wasn't used to the feeling of a house listening back. I'd stayed in cabins that were falling apart, winter rentals that sat empty half the year, even houses waiting to be sold after somebody died in them. None of them made me feel like I'd walked into somebody else's shift the way Ashdown House did. I'm not the kind of guy people remember because I fill up a room. Most of the time I'm the opposite. I show up, figure out what needs doing, and do it before somebody else has to think about it. That's been most of my adult life, really. Keep the heat running, get the leak stopped, reset the breaker, pick up the keys, drop off the keys. Make sure the place looks the same when the owner comes back as it did when they left. If I'm tired, I joke a little. If something goes wrong, I deal with it and move on. I've always figured life stays manageable if you keep enough small things from becoming big ones. That wasn't optimism in some shiny, inspirational way. It was just how I'd learned to get through. Show up on time. Don't leave work half done. Don't promise what you can't follow through on. People act like that's old-fashioned now, but it still counts for something. Or at least I used to think it did. I'd been doing property work long enough to know my way around houses that weren't mine. Vacation cabins outside Asheville, second homes sitting empty half the winter, upscale rentals where the owners wanted somebody on the property if they were gone longer than a weekend. Some jobs were just checks and logs. Some meant staying overnight, especially if the weather was bad or the house was old enough to develop problems when nobody was looking. I knew what to do with heating systems that liked to cycle too hard, water lines that needed watching after a freeze, backup generators, sticky locks, flaky sconces, warped windows, delivery notes, security codes, contractor windows, all of it. There's a whole category of work built around keeping other people's lives from slipping while they're gone. I got good at that. For a while I had steadier work with a small property management outfit that handled mountain rentals in private homes. It wasn't glamorous, but it was regular. Then, life got messy in the way it tends to if you let one person's problems keep bleeding into your own schedule. I moved into freelance contracts because it gave me more room to answer calls I shouldn't still have been answering. That was the polite version of it anyway. The less polite version had a name, and it was Zach. Zach Frost is my younger brother by 8 years, which means I got a front row seat to every stage of him becoming exactly the kind of man people warn you about with a sigh before they even know him. He wasn't cruel. That would have been easier, honestly. Cruel at least gives you something clean to push against. Zach was worse in a more familiar way. He was impulsive, proud when he had no reason to be. The kind of guy who heard one wrong sentence in the wrong tone and decided the smartest thing to do was double down until everybody in the room got meaner. He always thought he could handle things right up to the second he couldn't. Then he'd call me. Not every time. Just enough. That was the part that kept the door open. If he'd been a complete screw-up from sunup to sundown, if he'd never once sounded ashamed, I could have cut him off a long time ago and slept better for it. But Zach always had just enough good left in him to make the bad harder to write off. He'd help a neighbor move a couch in the rain. He'd call our aunt on her birthday, even when he forgot his own bills. He'd swear up and down he was done with the drinking, done with the guys who were always one bad idea ahead of him, done putting me in the position of having to choose between being angry and being useful. Then my phone would ring after midnight. The call that put me in Ashdown House came 2 nights before I drove up there. I was in a motel parking lot outside Marion finishing paperwork from another property check when Zach's name lit up my screen. I almost let it go to voicemail. I should have. Instead, I answered and heard too much noise behind him and not enough air in his voice. "You got bail money?" Zach asked. I didn't answer right away. That was answer enough. Later, I got the cleaner version from a bondsman and half the details from a deputy who sounded bored enough to have told the story 10 times already that night. Zach had gotten into it with somebody at a gas station outside Old Fort. Maybe it started inside, maybe at the pumps, maybe because somebody said something smart, and Zach heard it as a challenge instead of what it probably was, which was nothing worth carrying home. By the time law enforcement got there, one guy had a split lip, Zach was still swinging, and during the takedown, he managed to kick through part of the glass on the cooler door by the register. Assault, resisting arrest, property damage, enough to hold him, enough to cost money. "If you want him out before arraignment, you need the money fast," he told me. Fast was the problem. Fast usually is. I sat in that parking lot with the phone hot against my ear and did the math I already knew wasn't going to work. What I had in checking, what I was waiting on from 2 invoices, what I might be able to float on a card without wrecking the next month, too. It still came up short, not by a little, by the kind of amount that makes your chest go tight because you know you're about to say yes to something you'd otherwise think twice about. When I called Zach back, I kept my voice as flat as I could. "I need you not to make this worse," I told him. Zach was quiet for a second. I didn't call to make it worse. That was the thing about him. Sometimes he'd say something honest enough to make it harder to stay mad. The Ashdown House job hit my phone the next morning through a contact I'd worked with before, one of those people who hear about temporary estate coverage before it ever makes it to a public board. Live-in caretaker, 5 days, isolated property, pay on completion, expedited. It was enough money to solve the immediate problem, and enough of a number that I knew there would be strings attached, even before I saw the address outside Black Mountain. Still, the timing was too exact to ignore. I told myself it was just a rich family house with strange habits and a short handoff. 5 days. Do the job, get paid, get Zach out. That was the version I carried with me up the mountain, the practical version, the one where every choice still made sense. I took Ashdown House because I needed money faster than I needed to trust my instincts. By daylight, Ashdown House made the kind of sense I could work with. The first floor was laid out the way a lot of old estates are, built for movement and visibility at the same time. The kitchen sat deep in the back of the house, connected to a pantry big enough to hold dry goods for a family that shopped like weather might cut them off for a week. Off, that was the laundry room, a mudroom entrance, and a narrow service hall that let you move without crossing the main rooms if you didn't need to. The front half of the floor held the main hall, the library, the dining room, and a small glass sitting room that faced the mountain slope behind the house. In the morning, that room caught the first pale light off the trees. By afternoon, it just looked cold. The second floor was what I expected from a place that size. Guest rooms, family bedrooms, storage closets, a sitting area at the landing, more rugs than necessary, and enough framed photographs to remind you the house belonged to people who liked seeing themselves in it. Nothing up there felt strange. Quiet, yes. Formal, sure. But still part of the same house. The top floor was where that feeling changed. You got there by taking the main staircase to the second floor landing, then continuing up a shorter final run that bent slightly out of sight before opening onto the upper hall. It wasn't a separate wing. It wasn't locked off. But it felt cut away from the rest of the house in a way the lower floors didn't. The ceiling was lower up there, the hallway narrower. Even the air felt a little flatter, like sound didn't carry the same. The whole place had the feel of something added late or altered too carefully to look altered at all. You could still tell, though, houses carry their edits if you spend enough time in them. I learned the daily rhythm fast because that was the kind of thing I always learned first. The practical stuff gives you a way into a place. If you understand what's supposed to happen in the ordinary hours, you notice quicker when something slips. Ruthie Bell arrived just after 8 a.m. Both mornings I saw her, always in the same dark coat, always carrying the same canvas tote and travel mug. She handled light kitchen work, wiped surfaces, checked linens, folded towels, and moved through the first 2 floors with the speed of somebody who knew exactly what belonged where and didn't need to think about it anymore. She wasn't unfriendly, just efficient. The kind of woman who had probably spent years taking care of other people's spaces and had stopped wasting words on anything that didn't help the work move. Marlon Pike worked the grounds. He came and went by the gravel drive or the back walk, depending on what needed his attention. He dealt with the greenhouse glass, the shed latch, the old stone steps leading down the slope, loose screws in the handrail, swollen wood on the garden gate, and whatever small outdoor thing in a state that old always had waiting to fail next. He carried himself like a man who had been fixing the same property long enough to stop seeing most of it as separate jobs. To him, it was all one long maintenance problem with seasons attached. That left me in the middle, which was familiar territory. I checked the utility room, made sure the heat was cycling right, logged the exterior lights, sorted the mail, reset a stubborn breaker in a side closet, tightened a loose knob on a bathroom door upstairs, and made note of a draft around one of the library windows that would need weather stripping before real winter settled in. Nothing dramatic. That was part of what made the house feel manageable at first. The work itself was ordinary. It was the edges of it that weren't. The first time I noticed it clearly, Ruthie was in the laundry room folding towels into neat thirds. I was leaning against the doorframe with a clipboard, going over what had been done and what still needed checking before dark. Somewhere above us, not loud enough to call it a noise exactly, came a soft sound from the direction of the stairs. It might have been a floorboard. It might have been old wood settling under a shift in temperature. Ruthie stopped folding for half a second. Not enough to look guilty or scared, just enough to tell me she had heard it too. Then she went right back to work. A few minutes later, I asked the question lightly, mostly to see how she handled it. "You don't need the top floor till evening," Ruthie said. I looked toward the stairs. "Why's that?" She kept folding towels. "Because you don't." That was all she gave me. It wasn't the answer itself that stuck with me. It was how flatly she said it, like the conversation had already gone one sentence longer than necessary. I let it go. People who work old houses for a long time collect little systems and preferences that sound ridiculous from the outside. I'd seen owners insist on certain doors staying open, certain lamps staying on, certain rooms never being aired out after rain. Money and habit make strange roommates. I filed Ruthie's answer under that and moved on. But then Marlon gave me almost the same feeling from the other direction. He was crouched by the back door in the afternoon, tightening something on the lower latch where the wood had started pulling away from the frame. I stepped out onto the stone walk to ask him about the greenhouse window on the east side and saw his eyes shift past me just briefly toward the upper landing visible through the kitchen glass. Not a full look, more like a check. Then he went back to the latch. We talked through the work list, the weather, the way the cold was coming early for that part of the mountain. Just old house talk. Then he said something that should have landed like nothing and didn't. "It's an old house," Marlon said. He kept his eyes on the wrench in his hand. "Old houses get used to routine." "You mean pipes and drafts?" I asked. Marlon took a second before answering. "Sure." That pause was what stayed with me. Men like Marlon don't pause unless they're deciding how much truth to spend. By late afternoon, the light had already started draining off the back slope. In the mountains, it doesn't take long once it goes. The glass room turned gray first, then the library windows. Then the whole first floor took on that early evening dimness where you start seeing the house by lamplight instead of weather. I finished the last of my small checks, wrote down a couple of maintenance notes for myself, and made another pass through the downstairs just to keep moving. Ruthie left before dusk. Marlon headed down the drive not long after, his truck tires crunching over the gravel until the sound faded out past the trees. For the first time all day, the estate was empty in the way that mattered. No voices from the kitchen, no tools outside, no movement except mine. That was when the house seemed to pull back into itself again. I stood in the main hall with the fading daylight at my back and the staircase rising in front of me. The lower floors still felt like rooms, useful rooms, measured rooms, spaces I could work in and understand. The top floor felt like something else, and with everyone else gone, it felt like it was finally my turn to find out what. Mrs. Lenore Voss handled the handoff the way some people hand over a business account, cleanly. No wasted motion, no softness where she didn't think softness belonged. She met me in the main hall a little after 6 p.m. May, already dressed to leave, gloves on, coat buttoned, one of those people who could stand perfectly still and still make it clear she was in the middle of moving. Her husband was outside by then with the driver. I could hear the dull crunch of shoes on gravel through the front door every time the wind pressed against it. The house was still lit for evening, warm lamps on, fire banked low, everything in place. It looked less like a home being left for a few days than a stage set between acts. She didn't waste time showing me things I already knew. I had the keys, the utility notes, the contact sheet, the thermostat schedule, the gate code, the pantry inventory, all of that. She'd already gone over the practical systems with me earlier, and I'd spent enough of the day inside the place to get the shape of it in my head. What she was there for now was something narrower. She reached into her coat pocket and handed me a folded cream-colored card. It was thick stock, not ordinary paper, with my name written nowhere on it and no explanation given before she let me open it. Inside were 5 typed instructions, spaced far apart, as if each one deserved its own room. "The top floor has its own routine," Mrs. Voss said. I looked at the card in my hand. "Is someone staying up there?" She met my eyes. "No one you need to disturb." That answer should have irritated me more than it did. On a different job, with different money on the line, maybe it would have. But by then I already knew Ashdown House was one of those places where information was sorted into categories before it was handed out, and I wasn't in the category that got all of it. The first instruction was about the tea tray. At 8:40 p.m., bring the tray to the top floor and place it on the red runner before the final door at the end of the hallway. Knock twice. Step back 5 paces. Leave immediately. Do not remain to observe. I read it twice, mostly because of that last line. Do not remain to observe. Not, do not linger. Not, do not wait. Observe. It sounded less like a house rule and more like something copied down from an earlier warning. Mrs. Voss watched me finish the line. At 8:40, not 8:39 and not 8:45, Mrs. Voss said. That exact? I asked. Yes. There are wealthy people who build whole lives around tiny preferences and expect everyone else to move around them. I've worked for enough of them not to find exact timing suspicious on its own. Some want curtains opened at a certain hour because they like the light a certain way. Some want music left on in one room because they think silence makes the place feel empty. I told myself the tea tray belonged in that category. Maybe there was an older relative who used that floor. Maybe there had been one, and the habit stuck. Houses collect habits the same way they collect drafts. The second line was about the lights upstairs. After dark, turn on only the 3 left wall sconces on the top floor. Leave the final sconce by the window unlit. Do not allow the hall to go fully dark. Do not allow it to be fully bright. That one pulled my attention harder. Mrs. Voss turned slightly toward the staircase, as if the floor itself helped explain what she meant. The hallway must not feel empty, and it must not feel awake, she told me. It was an odd sentence, but not the theatrical kind of odd. It landed like something she'd said often enough that she no longer heard anything strange in it. That was what made it harder to dismiss. If she'd leaned into it, lowered her voice, tried to make it spooky, I would have written the whole thing off as rich people folklore before she got to the next line. But she didn't. She said it the same way she might have said, "Don't leave the north windows cracked in cold weather." The third rule was the first one that made me feel the floor under the conversation shift. If the top floor bell rings once, do not respond. If it rings twice, answer from the foot of the stairs. I hear you. Do not ascend. If it rings 3 times, leave the hall area at once and secure the kitchen door. I looked up from the card. Mrs. Voss didn't move. If the bell rings twice, you answer from the foot of the stairs. Nothing more. And if it rings 3 times, I asked. She didn't look at me when she said it. Then you've already waited too long. That was the first moment the whole handoff stopped feeling like eccentric domestic management and started feeling like something else. Not because she said it dramatically. She didn't. She said it in the same calm tone she'd used for every other instruction. That was the problem. I went on to the 4th line. If footsteps are heard overhead between 11 p.m. and 4 a.m., keep the kitchen radio on at low volume until they stop. Do not count the footsteps. Do not stand beneath them. That explained the radio at least, or explained why she wanted it there, which wasn't the same thing. Keep the kitchen radio low after 11, she said. Silence carries in this house. Carries what? I asked. She let that sit there. Sound travels badly in old wood. It wasn't a real answer. We both knew that. But by then, I was getting the shape of her method. She wasn't going to explain the rules. She was only going to state them clearly enough that I couldn't later claim confusion. The final line sat alone at the bottom of the card. If the final door on the top floor hallway is found standing open, leave it as it is. Do not touch the handle. Do not close the door. Do not address the room. Do not attempt to correct that floor. That phrasing stuck harder than the rest. Correct that floor. Not close the door. Not fix the situation. Correct that floor. What does that mean? I asked. If the door is open, leave it open, Mrs. Voss said. You are not here to correct that floor. Then she paused. Not long. Just enough. These rules are not difficult, she said. They only become difficult when people decide to improve them. That was it. No warning story, no old family tale, no explanation for the bell, the tea, the radio, or the door. She left me with the card and walked out of the house as if she'd just finished reviewing a maintenance checklist. I listened to the front door open, felt the brief rush of colder air, then heard it shut again. A little later came the muted sound of a car door outside, then tires over gravel, then nothing. After that, the house seemed to settle into a silence it had been waiting for. I stood alone at the foot of the stairs and read the card one more time. Part of me wanted to laugh it off. Strange family habits, old money ritual, maybe some medical privacy issue they didn't care to explain to hired help. I'd seen enough odd systems in expensive houses not to invent ghosts where routine would do, but the rest of me felt something settle wrong in my stomach. I checked the time. 8:34 p.m., 6 minutes to the tray. That was when the first night really started. I checked the clock 3 times before I picked up the tray. That wasn't nerves, not yet. It was just habit. In caretaker work, exact instructions are still instructions, even when they sound ridiculous. If an owner wants porch lights on at sunset instead of full dark, you do sunset. If they want the guest thermostat kept at 68 and not 69, you do 68. I'd built a decent living on understanding that people with enough money will always assume the difference matters, and the fastest way through a short job is usually to act like it does. At 8:39 p.m., I was standing in the kitchen with the tray laid out exactly the way Mrs. Voss had left it. White cup and saucer, small pot, folded napkin, no spoon in the sugar bowl. I noticed that again, and had the same passing thought I'd had earlier, that in most houses there's always a spoon. Something about the missing one made the tray feel less like service and more like a display. I pushed that thought aside, checked the time once more, and picked it up when the microwave clock changed over. The house sounded different with both hands occupied. Little things got louder when I couldn't automatically reach for a rail or a light switch. The soft thump of my own steps on the runner in the main hall, the faint tick in the wall somewhere near the library doors, the heating system winding down as I crossed toward the staircase. By the time I reached the second-floor landing, the house had gone quiet enough that I could hear the silverware on the tray give a single tiny tremor against the porcelain. The top floor stair was shorter than the main staircase but felt steeper. It bent slightly before it opened out, which meant you didn't really see the hallway until you were already there. That turned out to matter more than I would have liked. The first thing I noticed was the light. The 3 sconces on the left wall were on, exactly as instructed, and they gave off the kind of low yellow light that should have made the hallway feel ordinary. Instead, it made the shadows more exact. Each pool of light ended before the next one really began, so the spaces between them felt measured rather than accidental. The right wall stayed dimmer. At the far end, near the window, the last stretch of hall fell into a darker patch where the final sconce remained unlit. It wasn't black. I could still make out the line of the wall, the frame of the window, the end of the runner. But it looked like the light had chosen not to keep going. The runner itself was old red, worn flatter down the middle than at the edges, not threadbare, just thinned by years of feet taking the same path. The pattern had probably been ornate once. Up close, it was all dark vines and faded shapes. From where I stood with the tray, it looked almost like dried color rubbed into wood grain. The air up there felt cooler than the rest of the house, though not by much. Enough to notice against my hands where the silver tray pressed through the cloth. And at the end of the hall, exactly where the card had said it would be, stood the door. Closed. Plain. Dark painted wood, older than the rest of the trim by the look of it. No brass plate, no name, no visible keyhole from where I was standing. Just a closed door at the end of a hallway that should have taken maybe 6 or 7 seconds to walk and somehow felt longer than that. I've been in enough houses to know when space is playing tricks on your nerves. This didn't feel like that. It felt more like the hallway had the dimensions of a real place and the mood of a dream, and the two didn't line up. I walked down the runner slowly, careful not to jostle the tray. The floor under the carpet gave a little in places, old boards flexing the way old boards do, but not enough to creak. When I reached the end, I crouched and set the tray exactly where the card had instructed, centered on the runner before the door. Then I knocked twice. The sound was smaller than I expected, not hollow, not solid either. More like the door took the impact and kept it. I stood up, counted out 5 backward paces the way Mrs. Voss had told me, and stopped. That should have been the end of it. I should have turned around right then and gone back downstairs. Instead, I stayed. Not long. Just long enough to see if any part of the thing made sense once it actually happened. I told myself that was all it was. Professional curiosity. A need to know whether someone on the other side would open the door, take the tray, cough, say thank you, do anything at all that would pin the whole ritual back to the ordinary world where I preferred it. The door never moved. No light appeared beneath it. No shadow crossed the gap. I didn't hear footsteps from inside. For a second, I felt stupid standing there in the half-lit hall, waiting on a closed door like I was the one who didn't understand the rules of the place. Then I heard something small and exact. A soft ceramic sound. Not loud. Just the faint scrape of porcelain shifting against metal, as if someone had touched the cup or moved it a fraction of an inch across the tray. I didn't see a hand. I didn't see the door open. I just heard that one careful sound, close enough to be unmistakable, and every muscle in my shoulders tightened at once. I turned and walked back down the hall without hurrying, mostly because hurrying would have meant admitting to myself that something had happened. By the time I reached the stairs, my heartbeat had moved up a notch in my chest, hard enough that I could feel it in my throat when I swallowed. I kept going down to the main floor, set my empty hands on the kitchen counter, and stood there until the feeling passed enough for me to think straight again. Or straight enough. There are a lot of explanations a man can build for one small noise in an old house: weight shift, cooling pipes, the tray settling after I set it down, a draft getting under the saucer. None of them were great, but all of them were still better than jumping to conclusions on the first night, because one sound in one hallway landed wrong. That was what I told myself anyway. I slept badly, which wasn't unusual for a first night in a new place, but not so badly that I'd call it fear. More like the kind of sleep where your body never fully agrees with the mattress. I woke before dawn, listened to the house for a minute, then got up and started the day. The tray was still upstairs when I went back for it. I don't know what I expected. Maybe nothing. Maybe that was the problem. The hallway looked the same in morning light as it had the night before, only flatter and less theatrical. The sconces were off. The runner looked older. The window at the end held a dull gray mountain sky. The door was closed. The tray sat where I'd left it, but it had been handled, not moved far. Not enough that somebody careless would have noticed. The cup was sitting at a slightly different angle on the saucer, turned a little off from where I remembered placing it. The napkin had a crease in it that hadn't been there before, and the cup itself was empty. I picked it up and saw a dark ring at the rim, thin and uneven, almost like soot mixed into old tea. Not lipstick, not dirt exactly. More like something dry had touched the porcelain after the liquid was gone. I was still looking at it when Ruthie came into the kitchen with her coat over one arm and stopped just inside the doorway. "You look tired," Ruthie said. I held up the tray. "Does someone come in after I'm asleep?" She looked at the cup, then at me. "Did you do it the way she told you?" "Mostly," I said. That was what bothered me. She didn't answer the question. She didn't have to. The way her eyes settled on that word told me enough. In that house, mostly and exactly, weren't neighbors. They were different things. I found Marlin outside near the gravel drive a little later, tightening the chain on the side gate where the latch had started dragging. The morning had that sharp mountain cold that wakes up your teeth if you breathe too deep through your mouth. I walked up with the cup still in mind and asked the question more directly than I had with Ruthie. He listened without interrupting, one hand still on the wrench, then spat off into the grass before he answered. "Don't get curious up there," Marlin said. I gave him a look. "You say that like it's an option." He kept his eyes on the gravel. "It is at first." That stayed with me through the rest of the day more than I wanted it to. By evening, the house had started doing that thing it did where the light drained out of it in layers. The glass room went gray. The library turned to reflection. The main hall lamps came on. I moved through the kitchen checking small things I'd already checked once, not because they needed it, but because I wanted my hands busy. Then, from somewhere above the second-floor landing, I heard the bell ring once. I froze where I stood. The bell rang once, clear enough that I felt it, more than heard it at first. I was standing in the kitchen with one hand on the counter and the other still holding the dish towel I'd been using to dry out the sink after rinsing my mug. The sound came from above the second-floor landing, thin and old-fashioned, not electronic, not loud, but clean. A room bell, the kind of sound that should belong to another century. I stayed exactly where I was. That was what the card said to do if it rang once. Nothing. No answer, no movement, no going up to check. So I listened. That was the part that got under my skin, not the bell itself. The silence after it. The house didn't react the way a normal house reacts after a sound. There was no settling noise, no follow-up creak, no shift of air in the ducts, nothing to absorb it. The ring just seemed to stop and leave a shape behind. I stood there with the towel in my hand and counted out a few seconds in my head without meaning to. 5, 10, 15. Nothing. I told myself that was proof the rule was ridiculous. If nothing happened after one ring, then maybe none of it meant anything. Maybe it was all part of some private Voss family routine that had survived long past the person or reason that started it. Rich people are good at preserving useless things if the useless thing once belonged to someone important. Then the bell rang twice, not immediately after. There was a gap, long enough for me to almost breathe normally again. Then 2 quick, precise pulls from somewhere above me. I don't know why that affected me more than the first ring. Maybe because it matched the card too perfectly. If it had rung 3 times right away or started up in some irregular way, I might have felt better. Mechanical issue, bad old wiring, something explainable. But 2 rings, after one, in the exact pattern I'd been handed ahead of time, hit a different part of my brain. I went to the foot of the stairs. The air in the main hall felt a little colder there, or maybe I only noticed it because I'd stopped moving. I kept one hand loose at my side and looked up toward the bend leading to the top floor, though I didn't go any farther than the bottom step. That much, at least, I followed exactly. "I hear you," I said. My voice sounded smaller in that hall than it should have, not weak, just swallowed fast. For maybe 2 seconds, nothing changed. Then, somewhere above, so soft I almost convinced myself I'd imagined it, I heard a faint movement stop. Not start. Stop. Like something had been shifting its weight and then decided not to anymore. I stood there another few beats, listening hard enough to make the back of my neck ache, then went back into the kitchen and dried the same clean spot on the counter twice before I noticed what I was doing. That was the first time the rule stopped feeling decorative. The next morning I started looking for the trick in it, not because I was brave. Because once something crosses the line from odd to specific, I need a system for it, or I get stuck thinking around it all day. I found the old bell panel wiring in a closet off the service hall, tucked behind a painted wood access door that had probably been opened and closed more often than any guest would ever realize. The setup looked old but maintained. Cloth-wrapped wire in some places, updated connections in others, a relay box that had been replaced more recently than the rest. Nothing hacked together. I followed what I could safely follow without taking half the wall apart, then checked the fuse box in the utility room and the breaker panel beside it. Everything made sense. That was the problem. There was no clever hidden speaker, no timer rigged into some old service system, no loose contact waiting to explain why the bell had rung exactly the way the card said it would. The circuits that mattered were intact. The switchboard components I could inspect looked clean. I even stood there longer than I needed to, staring at labeled lines and trying to feel some satisfaction from the ordinary logic of electrical systems. Wires either carry something or they don't. Contacts either close or they don't. I've always liked that about physical work. It doesn't care what story you want. It just does what it does. Ashdown House wasn't offering me that kind of comfort. I found Ruthie in the upstairs linen room around mid-morning, sorting pillowcases with the same steady efficiency she brought to everything else. The room smelled like detergent and cedar blocks. A small space heater ticked in one corner. Outside the window, the slope behind the house was all bare branches and washed-out sky. I leaned on the doorframe and kept my tone easy. "Was there ever somebody sick up there?" I asked. Ruthie kept folding. I gave her a second to answer and watched her thumb smooth the edge of a case that didn't need smoothing. "An older relative, maybe," I said. "Somebody bedridden, somebody private." Ruthie didn't look at me. There was always somebody up there. That was all. I waited to see if she'd add to it. She didn't. The answer bothered me because of the tense. Not is, not was, one time, always. Like the floor had never belonged to empty space, only to different versions of the same problem. After that, I did what I always do when I don't like the shape of a place. I doubled down on routine. For the next couple of nights, I followed the card exactly. At 8:40 p.m., I carried the tray upstairs without checking the time more than once. I set it on the runner, knocked twice, stepped back 5 paces, and left immediately. No waiting, no listening, no pretending I was above instructions anymore. After dark, I turned on only the 3 sconces on the left side of the top floor hall and left the final one by the window dark. That arrangement never stopped looking wrong to me. The light hit the runner in broken pieces and left the far end of the hall in a shallow gloom that seemed less like darkness than omission. But I did it. When the bell rang twice, I stood at the foot of the stairs and gave the answer. "I hear you," I said. Every time I did, there'd be some tiny shift above, a hush, a stop. Once, what sounded like the faintest pressure change, like a door inside a distant room easing against its frame. Never enough to point to, always enough to register. After 11 p.m., if I was still awake, I kept the kitchen radio on low. That was stranger than the bell in some ways, because the radio helped, not in a dramatic way. It didn't banish anything. It just changed the atmosphere of the kitchen enough that I could stay in it. Late-night AM talk, old country songs, weather reports from counties farther west, static between stations when I adjusted the dial too fast. Ordinary sound. Human sound. It made the room feel occupied. And when the footsteps started overhead, the radio gave me something else to listen to. The first 2 nights I heard them, I followed the rule cleanly. I kept the volume low and I did not count. That sounds easier than it is. A pacing sound on a floor above you has a way of trying to organize your thoughts around it. You start hearing the distance between steps, the rhythm, the turn, the return. It wants to become a pattern. I fought that mostly by keeping my hands busy, rinsing a cup, rewriting a note I'd already written once, checking the same lock twice. Then, on the 3rd night, I slipped. Not because I meant to. That was the part I hated most later. There was no big decision, no rebellious moment where I told myself I had a right to know. I was standing at the kitchen counter just after midnight, with the radio playing low enough that I could barely make out the announcer's voice through the static, and the footsteps started above me again, one end of the hall to the other, turn, back again. I kept my eyes on the counter and told myself not to do it, but the mind likes counting when the body feels trapped. Count fence posts from the passenger seat, count motel room numbers from the balcony, count seconds until a pain passes. Counting gives you a shape, and a shape feels like control. So I started counting the steps without meaning to. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. The pace stayed even. 6, 7, 8, 9. I knew roughly how long that hallway was by then. I'd walked it enough. I knew how many steps it took me carrying the tray. 10, 11, 12, 13, 14. The footsteps kept going. I remember the exact sensation that hit me then. Not fear first. Confusion. A hard, dry confusion that made my skin tighten over the backs of my hands. The number should have turned by then. It didn't. 15, 16, 17. The radio hissed softly and I realized I'd leaned closer to the counter without noticing. 18, 19, 20, still pacing. Same measured rhythm. Same even spacing. The kitchen began to feel wrong around the edges. The room itself didn't change, not in any visible way, but the distance between me and the doorway seemed a little longer than it had a minute ago. The ceiling felt higher. The sound of the footsteps didn't belong overhead anymore so much as through the whole structure. I stopped counting. The second I did, the radio filled with a wash of soft static, like somebody had turned the dial a fraction off the station without touching it. The voice disappeared. All that stayed was the hiss and the pacing. Then the steps stopped too. Not gradually. All at once. The silence that followed had weight to it. I didn't sleep much that night. In the morning I went upstairs for the tray later than usual because I had to spend a few extra minutes convincing myself I wasn't being stupid. Daylight made everything look ordinary again, and I hated that. Ordinary in daylight is one of the meanest tricks a place can pull. The tray was where it should have been. The cup was empty again, and tucked beneath the saucer, half hidden under the edge as if slid there after the fact, was a small cream card that hadn't been there before. 2 words, typed. You counted wrong. I stood there staring at it long enough that my fingers started to go cold around the tray handle. The thing about a message like that is that there's no safe way to receive it. If it's a prank, then somebody in that house is watching me much more closely than they have any right to. If it's not a prank, then I've already crossed into a kind of trouble I don't know how to name. I took the card downstairs in my pocket and found Marlin out by the side gate near noon. He was tightening chain links where the metal had sagged from years of weather, shoulders hunched against the wind, cap pulled low. I didn't bother easing into it. "You ever hear it walk?" I asked. Marlin took his time answering. "Everybody hears it walk." The words landed hard because he didn't say if. He didn't ask what I meant. He knew. "Then why stay?" He looked at the house. "Because it stayed first." I wish I could say that answer cleared things up. It didn't. But it confirmed the one thing I needed confirmed, which was that the sounds weren't just mine. The house had a history with them, and I was the one late to it. That night when I took the tray upstairs, the hallway felt subtly different before I could point to anything specific. Maybe it was the light. Maybe it was the distance between the sconces. Maybe it was just that I'd started dreading the place enough to notice every inch of it. The hall didn't seem physically longer exactly, more like it took my body longer to cross even when my eyes knew better. And the final door was standing open. Not wide, just a few inches, enough to see a strip of darkness inside, enough to know with absolute certainty that I had not left it that way. I stopped dead and felt the tray shift slightly in my hands. Rule 5. Leave it open. Do not touch the handle. Do not address the room. So that was what I did. I set the tray on the runner without knocking, because the car didn't say to knock if the door was already open, and I was suddenly in no mood to improvise around omitted language. Then I stepped back. From the narrow opening came the faintest sound, soft enough that I can't swear what it was even now. It might have been fabric dragging across wood. It might have been a chair leg moving half an inch over old boards. Whatever it wasn't a settling house noise. It had intent in it. Small, patient intent. I backed away and went downstairs without taking my eyes off the door until I hit the turn in the staircase. The next afternoon, Ruthie arrived, worked fast, and started gathering her things earlier than usual. I found her in the mudroom, slipping her arms into her coat before the light had even started to go. "You leaving already?" I asked. "I'm not staying late today," Ruthie said. "Why not?" I asked. She folded her coat over her arm. "Because I know what late feels like in this house." Then she left. That was the first day I realized everyone around Ashdown House had made some private arrangement with it except me. Ruthie knew exactly how late was too late. Marlin knew what walked upstairs and still measured his answers like a man handling fuel. Mrs. Voss had handed me rules instead of explanations, because rules were apparently the only thing she thought I needed, and I had already broken 2 of them. After that, the pattern started slipping. The bell no longer rang, only when I could convince myself it made a kind of twisted sense. Once it rang twice before I had even finished washing the dinner dishes. Another time it rang once just after I'd turned the 3 hallway sconces on, as if checking whether I was still following along. One night, the leftmost sconce gave a tiny twitch of light, not enough to go dark, just enough to pulse out of sequence and come back. Another time, the kitchen radio shut itself off in the middle of a weather report and clicked back on a few seconds later in a wash of low static. Nothing escalated fast. That was what made it worse. Everything came a notch at a time, as if the house or whatever held to that upper floor was testing how much deviation I would notice before I admitted it wasn't just a house anymore. By then I understood something I should have understood the first night. Those rules weren't written for people who wanted to understand the house. They were written for people who only needed to keep it calm long enough to get out alive. By the 4th night, lack of sleep had started changing the texture of everything, not enough to make me useless. I was still doing the work, still checking the locks, still keeping the lights right, still bringing the tray up at 8:40 p.m. and answering when the bell rang twice. But exhaustion does something ugly to judgment. It doesn't just make you tired. It thins the distance between the thing in front of you and the thing you're trying not to think about. That was Zach. I'd kept my phone on silent most of the time in the house because I couldn't stand one more sound cutting across the wrong silence, but I still checked it too often. No new voicemail. One text from the bondsman asking for confirmation on timing. Another from Zach from earlier that day, short enough to be worse for it. "You hear anything yet?" I didn't answer. I stared at it until the screen dimmed, then put the phone face down on the kitchen table and let the radio keep muttering low static and weather talk into the room. What kept coming back wasn't the text, though. It was something Zach had said to me 2 years earlier, after another night, another call, another mess that became mine the second he heard my voice pick up. He'd been drunk then, not mean, just stripped down enough to say the thing under the thing. "You always think you can leave me in it," Zach told me once. At the time, I'd snapped back at him, told him he was the one always stepping in it, told him maybe he should try a week of not making his life everybody else's cleanup job. I'd meant it too. But that line stayed, maybe because it had enough truth in it to hurt. I'd spent years trying not to leave him in it, whatever it happened to be. Jail, debt, bad friends, broken nose, wrecked truck. Shame he acted like anger because it looked better on him. By that night in Ashdown House, I was carrying him around in my head the same way I was carrying the rules. Too carefully, too often. At 8:40 p.m., I took the tray upstairs again. The house was so quiet. I could hear the cloth under the silver tray shift against my palm when I adjusted my grip. The 3 left sconces were on. The final light near the window stayed dark. The runner looked almost black at the edges where the light missed it. I came around the bend onto the top floor hall and saw the door at the end already standing open, just a few inches. I stopped. The air felt wrong around it. Not colder, not heavier, just too still, as if the hall had been listening for me and stopped moving anything else once I arrived. I could hear my own breathing more than my footsteps. The tray felt heavier than it should have by the time I got close enough to set it down. I did that much right. I lowered it carefully onto the runner and stepped back. The opening in the door was narrow enough that I couldn't see anything inside except a strip of darkness and the edge of the frame. No light, no movement, no smell coming out of the room, which bothered me more than if there had been one. Rooms usually smell like something: dust, wood, linen, closed air. This one gave me nothing. I should have left right then. Instead, I stood there, staring at the gap, waiting for the kind of sense that never came in that house. Then the voice came from inside. "Aid," the voice said from the room. I stopped dead. It was Zach's voice, not a rough imitation, not a generic male voice that happened to hit some old nerve. It was his. The exact tone he used when he was trying to sound like he wasn't scared and not quite making it. Too low, too casual, thin at the edges. "Aid, don't do that. Don't leave me here." My mind knew immediately it wasn't real. Zach was nowhere near Black Mountain. He was in County Holding, or out by then, and too proud to admit he needed another thing from me, or asleep on somebody's couch, or anywhere else in the world but behind that door. My body didn't care. That was the worst part. Logic fired and failed in the same second. I knew better and still felt everything in me go toward that voice. The same reflex that had dragged me through years of his damage lit up before I could get hold of it. Go fix it. Go get him. Go make sure he isn't alone with whatever he's done now. "Zach?" I asked. My voice didn't sound like mine. I heard myself take one step forward, then another. I saw my own hand lift toward the knob like it belonged to somebody else. The metal was so cold, it shocked me. Not cold the way brass gets cold in a drafty house, not mountain night cold. This felt dead. Deep, unnatural cold, the kind that sinks through your skin before your nerves catch up. The second my fingers closed around it, every sound in the house dropped out. No radio below, no heat in the vents, no hum in the walls, nothing. The silence hit so hard my ears rang inside it. Then, from behind me, farther down the hallway where I had just come from, I heard bare footsteps begin moving slowly across the runner. Not fast, not running. Slow enough to make each one distinct. A soft press into old carpet, a pause, another step. I turned so fast the edge of the tray clipped my leg and sent a tiny shiver through the silver. The hallway behind me was empty. 3 sconces glowing on the left, dark wall on the right, runner stretching back toward the stairs. Nothing there. The footsteps stopped anyway. That was when I understood I had done the one thing in that house that couldn't be walked back. I don't remember grabbing the tray. I must have, because it was in my hands when I hit the stairs. I went down too fast, caught myself on the banister, nearly missed the turn at the landing, and made it to the kitchen breathing hard enough to hurt. I set the tray on the counter and gripped the edge until the room stopped tilting. Then I looked at the folded card Mrs. Voss had left on the table. For the first time since I'd arrived, it didn't look fussy or strange or overly specific. It looked small. And I knew with a certainty I hadn't let myself feel before that I had crossed something in that house that better behavior wasn't going to fix. After I touched the doorknob, the house stopped pretending the rules were enough. That was the cleanest way I ever found to put it. Up to that point, everything had still happened inside a structure. Strange, yes. Wrong enough to keep me awake, definitely. But structured. The bell followed its pattern. The hallway lights stayed where they were supposed to stay. The radio mattered when it was supposed to matter. The footsteps, however impossible they sounded, still kept mostly to the hours and the floor I'd been warned about. There was a system, and the system at least suggested limits. That changed the second I broke the one rule that seemed written less like a procedure and more like a boundary. The bell started ringing at the wrong times, not wildly. Nothing in Ashdown House ever lurched if it could tighten first, but the pattern shifted. One ring in the middle of the afternoon while I was checking a draft at the library window. 2 rings before I'd even turned the top floor sconces on. One night it rang twice, then once a few minutes later, as if it had changed its mind about what kind of answer it expected. The sounds were always clear, always old-fashioned, always precise enough to make me stop whatever I was doing and listen with my whole body. The lights changed too. Before, the 3 left sconces upstairs had held steady once I switched them on. After the doorknob, they started behaving like they were taking turns belonging to the hall. One would dim just enough to notice, then return. Another would give a quick dry pulse, not a full flicker, more like a blink. Twice I found the last dark stretch near the window less dark than it should have been, not lit exactly, just not obeying the arrangement anymore. The radio got worse in a quieter way. It would cut out for 3 or 4 seconds and return in the middle of a sentence or drift into static without my touching the dial, then slide back into music or weather like nothing had happened. Once, just after midnight, I heard the announcer's voice flatten and drag like tape played too slow, then clear again before I could decide whether I had really heard it. I stopped trusting silence, but I also stopped trusting the thing that was supposed to protect me from it. And the footsteps were no longer only upstairs. That part mattered most. Before, when they paced the top floor, there had at least been the thin comfort of direction. Above me, end of hall to end of hall. Turn, return. Now the sound pressed differently through the house. It felt directly overhead no matter where I stood. In the kitchen, in the main hall, even once in the library where there shouldn't have been any open space above me at all. The structure had stopped helping me locate it. Or maybe it had stopped caring whether I could. By morning, I knew I was done asking careful questions. I found Marlin near the shed around 10 a.m., shoulder deep in a rusted latch assembly he'd taken off one of the side gates. The air had that hard mountain brightness that makes every metal surface look colder than it is. He glanced up when he saw me crossing the gravel, then went back to the latch like he already knew why I was there. I stopped a few feet away and didn't ease into it. It used my brother's voice, I said. Marlin kept working for a second too long. Then he set the wrench down on the tailgate beside him and wiped one hand over his mouth. "It don't like change," Marlin said. I looked at him. "What is it?" He kept his eyes on the front steps. "Something this house learned not to argue with." That answer should have sent me into another round of questions, but something about the way he said it made me hold still. Not because it was satisfying, because it sounded tired in a way that meant he'd been living near the truth for a long time and hated how little use the words actually were. I stepped closer. "The Vosses know what it is?" Marlin shook his head once. "Know enough. That wasn't enough for me anymore." "They just live with it?" He bent, picked up the latch, then set it right back down without fitting it anywhere. "Rich people call a thing manageable and keep feeding it time." I didn't say anything for a second after that. The sentence landed too neatly against everything I'd seen in the house. The tray, the lights, the radio, the answer at the foot of the stairs, not superstition, not worship, maintenance. Marlin finally looked at me then, and maybe he could see in my face that I'd gone past the point where vagueness helped. "It was here before you," he said. "Before me too, near as I can tell. Family never got rid of it, never figured it out clean. They just figured out what settled it, what kept it where it was meant to stay." The words moved through me slower than they should have, Maybe because some part of me had still been hoping for a smaller explanation. An old relative hidden behind money. A damaged person, a sealed-off room, a private arrangement with some living human being. But no. The Voss family had not been protecting a secret in the ordinary sense. They'd been preserving a routine around a presence none of them could remove, and none of them fully understood. The tea wasn't hospitality. The lights weren't decoration. The bell response wasn't courtesy. The radio wasn't comfort. Every part of it was a way of making the house continue to behave like itself, night after night, so that whatever held to that upper floor never had reason to test whether anything had changed. It didn't need feeding in any literal way. It needed continuity. Habit. A house speaking to it in the same language, in the same order, with the same timing, until morning came and the next day began exactly where the last one left off. And I finally understood what I had actually been hired for, not just to check the heat or collect the mail or make sure pipes didn't freeze while the Vosses were overseas. They could have hired a local service to do any of that. They hired me because a body in the house was part of the pattern. Somebody to move through the rooms at the right times, somebody to answer the bell, somebody to carry the tray, somebody to keep the structure of presence intact long enough that the absence of the family wouldn't register as absence. I hadn't been covering a property. I'd been standing in for continuity itself. That was why the money was so good, not because the house was remote, because the job was worse than it looked, and they knew it. And touching the doorknob hadn't opened some simple horror movie door the way I wanted to think at first. I hadn't let something out in a clean, dramatic sense. What I'd done was more intimate than that. I'd shown it exactly where I could be reached. I'd let it test my weak point and confirm the voice that would move me fastest. It knew now that if it wanted me off the card, off the routine, out of position, it had a way to do it. Zach. That was the real damage, not the touch itself. The fact that the touch had answered a question. By then the idea of packing my bag and walking out should have been the obvious move. And if the story ended with me doing the obvious thing, maybe I'd still have something of my old life left in me. But leaving wasn't simple anymore. If the routine was the only thing keeping the house in one piece, then abandoning it in the state I'd already pushed it into wasn't escape. It was surrender. Mrs. Voss would be back the next day. Until then, I had one job left, and it wasn't the one written on the invoice. Keep the routine standing, keep the tea moving, the lights right, the answer ready, the radio alive, the hall from going fully dark or fully bright. Keep the house speaking in the same familiar sequence for one more night. By then I wasn't trying to understand it anymore. I was trying to keep the house speaking the same language to it for one more night. By the last night, I wasn't thinking about finishing the job anymore. I was thinking in smaller pieces than that. Keep the lights right. Keep the radio on. Don't answer the wrong thing. Don't touch what opens. Don't let the house feel empty. Don't let it feel awake. That was all I had left. The bell rang twice before I had even finished rinsing my plate in the kitchen sink. The sound cut through the house so cleanly it made the glass in the cabinet door tick. I dried my hands on the towel by the stove, stepped to the edge of the main hall, and looked up toward the turn in the staircase. "I hear you," I said. The words went up into the dark and disappeared. For a few seconds, nothing followed. Then the bell rang a third time. That sound hit deeper than fear. It felt mechanical, final, like some part of the house had moved into the next stage of something I was already late for. Mrs. Voss's instruction came back to me at once. If it rings 3 times, leave the hall area and secure the kitchen door. So I did. I backed into the kitchen, shut the door, turned the old brass lock, and stood there with my hand still on it. The radio was already on low, murmuring weather and static. Outside the windows, the mountain was just black glass. Inside, the kitchen light suddenly felt too bright, too exposed, so I clicked off the overhead and left only the smaller lamp by the pantry. Then the footsteps started. Not upstairs in the old, familiar way. Not at the far end of the top floor hall, where I could at least pretend distance still mattered. They moved above the kitchen, then seemed to cross toward the main hall, then somehow came back over me again. The sound had lost its geometry. I could no longer tell whether the house was carrying it wrong or whether something in the house no longer cared about the shape of the rooms. I turned the radio up one notch, then forced myself to turn it back down, low. The card had said low, not loud, not enough to challenge anything, just enough to keep the air from going empty. A minute later, the radio clicked off by itself. I stared at it, then crossed the kitchen in 3 fast steps and turned it back on. Static first. Then a woman's voice, reading the overnight forecast in a tone so ordinary, it almost made me laugh. Showers early, wind shifting west by morning, cold holding through the weekend. The footsteps stopped. Then, from somewhere in the main hall beyond the kitchen door, I heard Zach's voice. Not loud, not shouting, just enough to reach me. Aid. I shut my eyes once and opened them again. That was the part the thing upstairs understood now. Not just fear, obligation, the old reflex, the part of me that had spent years hearing one person hit bottom in different places and still going to get him because no one else would. Aid. Come on. I didn't move. Then it said the line that finally made my hands start shaking. Don't do that. Don't leave me here. I looked at the clock over the stove. 8:36 p.m. 3 minutes. That was what the whole night came down to. Not courage, not understanding. Just whether I could keep my body where it needed to be until the next correct thing had to happen. The bell rang once more. I waited. I kept my eyes on the clock and my hands where they were. At 8:40 p.m., I picked up the tray and took it upstairs. By then I was moving on a kind of stripped-down instinct. The kitchen radio muttered behind me. The main hall felt longer than it should have. When I reached the turn for the top floor, the 3 left sconces were already on, though I had no memory of turning them on. I told myself I must have. I told myself a lot of things that night. The hallway looked wrong the second I stepped onto it. Not dramatically wrong, worse than that. It looked almost correct, with just enough change in it to make the whole space feel untrustworthy. The distance between the sconces seemed stretched. The runner looked darker. The patch near the window no longer felt like shadow, so much as a place light had stopped agreeing to go, and the door at the end stood open, wider than before. Not all the way. Enough. I carried the tray down the hall and felt the pull of that opening like physical pressure. Not curiosity anymore. Pressure. The sense that if I looked inside, I would finally understand what the house had been teaching itself to live with all these years. I did not look. I set the tray down on the runner and stepped back. From somewhere inside the room came a soft movement, like fabric being dragged slowly over wood. Then another sound, lighter than that, like fingers resting against the inside of the frame. I kept backing away. Behind me, farther down the hall, the bell rang twice. I stopped at the head of the stairs, then forced myself down to the foot of them and did the only thing left that still belonged to me. I hear you, I said. The bell rang again. I hear you, I said louder. The house held still around the words. Then, from outside, through all that old wood and stone, I heard the crunch of tires on gravel. I've never been so relieved to hear a car in my life. The shift in the house was subtle but real. Not peace, nothing that generous. More like a change in attention. The pressure in the hallway eased by a degree. The radio downstairs stopped hissing. One of the sconces steadied. Mrs. Voss came in through the front door a minute later, gloves still on, coat buttoned, looking less like a woman returning from a trip than someone arriving for an inspection she already expected to fail. She took one look up the staircase before she looked at me. "You touched the door," Mrs. Voss said. I looked at her. It knew his voice. Mrs. Voss took off her gloves one finger at a time. "Yes," she said, "it does that when the house stops believing you belong in it." There were a dozen things I could have said to that. About the money, about the rules, about the fact that she had handed me a maintenance problem with a pulse and called it caretaking. None of them came out. I was too tired for anger by then. She passed me in the hall and looked up once more toward the top floor. "It will settle again," Mrs. Voss said. She looked past me toward the stairs. "Eventually." That was all. She paid me in full the next morning. No apology, no warning, no effort to pretend the job had been anything other than what it was. Just an envelope, a signature, and a calm, final nod that somehow felt colder than blame. By noon, I was off the mountain with the check in my pocket and Ashdown House falling away behind me in the rearview mirror. I used the money to get Zach out. He looked rough when I picked him up, tired and defensive, and trying to act like neither one bothered him. He took one look at me in the parking lot outside the bonds office and frowned. "You look like hell," Zach said. "I'm tired," I told him. That was all I had for him. The worst part is that it was true. After Ashdown House, I stopped sleeping in silence. Even now I keep something on at night, a radio, a fan, the television low in the next room, anything with enough human sound in it to keep a room from going completely empty. I don't like hearing footsteps overhead. I don't like dark stairwells. I smile less than I used to. Talk less, too. Nothing dramatic. People just assume life wore me down a little faster than it wears some men down. Maybe that's all this looks like from the outside. A few weeks after the job, I was sitting alone in my apartment with the radio on low and the kitchen light off, listening to rain tap against the window unit. The apartment above mine had been empty for days. I knew that because the building manager had told me the place was between tenants. Just after midnight, I heard a bell ring once above me. I sat very still. A few seconds later, it rang a second time. I answered before I could stop myself. After that, I left the radio on for the rest of the night and didn't look at the ceiling once.